World Affairs Roundup, next on International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs at UWM and Milwaukee Public Television present International Focus, a global magazine linking Wisconsin and the world.
Welcome to International Focus. I'm Doug Savage from the Institute of World Affairs at UWM with a post-election edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Today we'll be taking a freewheeling look at how the new political landscape may impact U.S. foreign policy in the remainder of President Obama's term. This week's midterm contests were largely seen as a referendum on a few critical domestic policy issues. But with a number of new faces in key legislative positions and a few heavy hitters sent to the showers, the results will also have an impact on the administration's foreign policy agenda. To help us explore whether politics is likely to stop at the water's edge in the months ahead, we're joined by two of our Roundup regulars. John Katzka, a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer who has conducted public diplomacy for the Department of State on 4 continents, and Robert Kraig, author of a number of articles and books dealing with the history and politics of American foreign policy. He currently serves as Executive Director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Well, maybe we can start with just the role foreign policy played in the run-up to the election. Now, we heard much about a few key domestic issues. Was there any foreign policy connection to the position that the ultimately successful candidates took?
Well, I would say in a very short answer, no. Foreign policy was nowhere near an important issue in this particular election. But that's not unusual. Most elections in the United States, even presidential elections, are more over domestic issues than foreign policy issues.
Yeah, the exit polling showed it was jobs, 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 and jobs, and Afghanistan was very low on the list. It was the only thing that really registered in terms of foreign policy. I mean, there's certainly polling that shows that the public is becoming weary of the longest war. It's past Vietnam, but it was not a major issue in voting in exit polls. In addition to that, neither side really tried to bring up foreign policy issues. The Tea Party is divided on foreign policy issues and campaigned on domestic issues. And Republicans didn't really necessarily want to bring up that in many ways they share more with the Obama foreign policy than Democrats did, who also didn't want to bring that up. So there's also candidates deliberately not raising foreign policy issues in addition to the public's understandable concern about unemployment and the economic crisis.
Well, you bring up the Tea Party movement. How would you assess the role of that sort of insurgency, if you will, within the GOP?
Well, it's still a little early to tell, I would say. It's been more permanent than some people thought it would be. There is some exit polling that supports the idea that a lot of people were influenced by the Tea Party. Some people, like the New York Times, has spun out that they're a major influence, that 4 in 10 might have influenced by them. It's hard to see, to know how permanent this is going to be, whether there's really a unity between the various loosely organized Tea Party groups. There's certainly a lot less agreement on foreign policy, for example, and there's probably a lot less agreement once you're governing as opposed to just being against something. And so that is a major challenge for the movement. I also want to say about the movement that there is a legitimate grassroots fervor. There are people in it, influenced by it, but it also has to be understood as something that's extremely well funded and orchestrated. Paradoxically, both of those are true. It's not one or the other. And a lot of the extra campaign money, the secret corporate money that came in because of the Supreme Court decision, Citizens United, actually was underwriting Tea Party activities, and the Tea Party was sort of the troops on the ground for that overall expenditures, which also included massive amounts of television and other political communication that went 9-to-1 for Republican candidates. And so it's a complicated thing, and it's both orchestrated and organic at the same time.
It sounds like a political party, because that's the same thing that the political parties do, is get a lot of this money, and a lot of the ads that we were subjected to, thank goodness that's over, were paid for by people outside the candidates themselves. But one of the points that, in addition to the jobs that Robert was talking about, there is another stream of concern, and that is government, and it's the size of government and its intrusiveness and how much it does and what it doesn't do, and the people who get into office who feel that they're entitled to stay there forever. And that's another part of the undercurrent that fuels the Tea Party movement.
So what do you think the effect of all of this has on the GOP caucus that we're likely to see now? Are they pulled to the right?
I don't know that we can say yet what the composition of these Tea Party people are. I mean, first of all, it is very uncomfortable for me to be able to say this person's on the right and this person's on the left. It depends upon the issue. Mm-hmm. I mean, Feingold was a good case in point. He mm-hmm. covered a range of positions depending upon how he felt about those things, and was out of touch or out of step with his president on a number of these issues. I think it's going to depend upon where they fit into. Few of them are likely to be in the moderate wing, that very small moderate wing of the Republican Party. But I don't think that they're going to be on the extreme.
It could be, I mean, I think John's right, at some party elements, it could be a proto-party. It's not a fully developed and party that's come together permanently. One of the reasons that the whole Tea Party strategy, and the strategy was orchestrated, though there is a grassroots intensity, was to not focus on the social issues, which often have wedged the wrong way for the right, and to focus on clearly on economic issues and government. Anti-government has been a strand not only of American thought, but especially conservative right-wing thought for years. It was to emphasize and blow that part up, not bring in the social issues. They'll require discipline not to bring them in, because a lot of the adherents still believe in these social issues, and not to emphasize foreign policy, which is at odds to some degree with a lot of the leaders in Congress, say your Senator McCain, your Senator Kyles, et cetera, who actually make their career focusing on foreign policy, but the movement itself didn't deliberately. And you do have a strange kind of divide. I think you're right about the ideology. If you look at the Pauls, Rand Paul, his father Ron Paul, they're isolationists. And they actually don't think we should be the policemen of the world, so to speak, which is very much at odds with the Republican establishment in the U.S. Senate especially. And so those are interesting divisions. So whether they can maintain that focus, it was one thing to keep that focus when you were in opposition to something, when what unites us, we're against Obama, versus when you're actually trying to govern. And so we don't know. I mean, the Perot grouping, which had some similarities to this, was also a proto-party. It never developed and congealed into a permanent party. And it's hard to create there are a lot of been proto-parties in this country that, because we have a two-party system, they tend not to become institutionalized as permanent parties.
The best lines, the best positions of the proto-party are taken on by one or both of the parties in power.
Right.
So
like populism in the 19th century, exactly.
You know, we talked a little bit about this division within the movement, or diversity within the movement as pertains to foreign policy. I mean, what sort of, how wide is the continuum, do you think?
Well, I think it's going to depend on the issue. I think on the Middle East, there is probably going to be a continuum of the tilt towards Israel and a modest interest in trying to resolve this whole issue. But in the backdrop of this whole thing is the likelihood that we are going to have two issues fighting for prominence. One is not to give the president any victories which would allow him to be able to run on that in 2012. The second is, fighting with that, is the idea that the American people are fed up with the fact that government can't operate and work. So there's going to be a struggle between those two positions on especially domestic issues. But there's some domestic issues that are going to spill over. The cap and trade bill, which is probably dead now, is going to impact on our ability to negotiate internationally about climate control. The arms control, the START agreement with Russia, may or may not be successful. If it is, it's going to have to happen in the lame duck Senate before the new senators come in. If that doesn't happen, that could affect, but I don't think it's that serious an issue.
Well, you know, what about just the role of foreign policy in general within the administration's priorities these days? I mean, there's sort of two schools of thought that a president could hew to. Given the fact that I'm likely stymied at home, let's go abroad and see what we can do, versus clearly I was not perceived as taking care of business at home. I need to not be perceived as going too far afield. So which
depends in some degree on the opposition, right? Because there's this tension, whereas the Tea Party did not focus on foreign policy deliberately, and so there's a tension, whereas you have a lot of Republican leaders who want to now assert themselves in foreign policy. So you have debates about which helps them more in terms of their ultimate goal, which is unseating Obama in 2012. For Obama, he needs to do something about the economic crisis. That is what swept Democrats out of the U.S. Senate and the House of Representatives, and he will be swept out if he doesn't do something. So he can't just do foreign policy, have the reverse of a Rose Garden strategy, a world tour strategy, and succeed. But on the other hand, he's less fettered there. He can look presidential if he can get some victories. So there are possible victories out there. The question is, are they really available as victories? Can you win a victory over preventing the proliferation of nuclear weapons to Iran? Hard to say whether you can get a victory out of that. Can you get peace between Israel and Palestine? Even harder, probably, to do that. The START treaty, you might be able to get it ratified during the lame duck session, where you need the 67 votes. That might be the 2/3, but that might be the only.
Cares?
But it's not going to affect things that directly. So, but it seems like as part of a strategy where he is being effective domestically, addressing those problems, but also looking presidential and having places where he can get achievements around the world. It's a combination. It's not one or the other.
But, you know, that's his perception domestically. How does the results of this election impact world perception of him?
Well, he's weakened as a result. There is no question about that. And also, his options internationally are constrained as well. First of all, we have so much of our resources and our manpower going into Iraq and Afghanistan that it allows precious little for elsewhere in the world. The economic downturn cuts off a lot of the options that the president might have in terms of taking on other international issues. The one issue that I came up with where he could get some resonance, especially if he was successful, is Iran. If he can come up with a way in which to change the relationship with Iran, this could have a significant impact in terms of making him a world statesman for the 2012 election.
Well, you know, we'll get into some of the specific issues in foreign policy when we come back for a break, but right now we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more International Focus.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back to International Focus. We're talking with John Katzka and Robert Kraig about the foreign policy impacts of the midterm election. Well, now let's look at a few of the issues and how the makeup of the next Congress is likely to impact the administration's foreign policy. Let's start with the UN and U.S. involvement in sort of multinational organizations generally. We saw definitely a re-engagement at the beginning of the Obama administration. How is this current Congress or future Congress likely to view those kinds of initiatives?
I think there was at the beginning of his administration. I don't think there has been any follow-through on that. There has been more interest in the G20 than there has been in the United Nations. So I don't see that as being an important point, except that the Republicans who are coming into office are less likely to be enamored with the UN and looking for significant reforms and therefore being a problem for the president.
It's one area where the Tea Party does have unity. There's one thing they can agree on, it is that multilateralism, the UN, is a bad thing, that people with blue helmets are causing problems all over the world, and so they will strongly unite and oppose any challenge to our unfettered national sovereignty, very much a throwback to George W. Bush's foreign policy. And so, you know, it might unify the other side, so that may be even more of a deterrent to doing anything that would suggest that we're in any way fettered in our full exercise and latitude of our national sovereignty.
Well, how about something you've both touched on, the New START Treaty? What is this Congress likely to think about that?
Well, once the Congress comes into office in January, then the chances of that getting through are much less so than now. It gets wrapped up in a whole number of other issues of our relationship with Russia. And the administration is less likely to bring those up. We prefer to do much of this negotiating quietly, out of the public eye, and outside of the purview of Congress.
I mean, it's a shame, because I thought one of the more promising original precepts in the Obama foreign policy was to focus on proliferation and the threat of nuclear weapons, and the START treaty is very much worth ratifying, but it's tied up now in military spending. Senator Kyle wants a commitment to modernize our nuclear forces in return, which I'm sure all of the military contractors are very anxious to have happen, in return for ratification. So there's a whole series of demands that some leading Republicans in the Senate have. They still may try, because they want it for his legacy and they believe in it, to try to get it through in the lame duck Congress. But I agree with John, if they don't do it in the lame duck Congress, there aren't probably 2/3 of the Senate in the new Congress.
Related to that is another issue that's going to be coming up. Obviously, they're going to be looking for places to save money. And there is probably not a great deal of courage amongst any of them to take on the entitlements. So when you begin to look around, defense spending is one of the areas, and one of the, you know, if you watch the way in which defense spending went up during the Vietnam War, and as soon as we got to a particular point where it became awkward, or that we were looking for economies, the end of the Cold War, there was the peace dividend. So the military was slashed at each of those points. These new members coming in are going to be caught in a struggle within themselves. Many of them are going to be pro-military, pro-defense, but they're also feel that they have a great responsibility to reduce the cost of government. And one of the easiest places to do it is in the defense budget.
I mean, it's a paradox in right-wing American ideology. The government that can do nothing, that excludes anything military, right? And the same with fiscal austerity. We spend, given where we are economically and given our relatively declining economic status, much more than we can afford on being a world policeman. And so, but it's very hard to cut bases or to cut any of these things. And Tea Party adherents who want to gut government get very upset when they hear about closing military bases around the world and think the military do no wrong. So it's one of those odd paradoxes where that kind of government, that kind of spending is considered off the books and out of bounds. So it remains to be seen. I think the Obama administration should focus on that, but they seem to take the attitude that they don't want to look weak and that will harm them in elections, and that's going to, in Afghanistan, that's going to be a major issue as well.
That segues very well to Afghanistan as the next topic. I mean, how is this new Congress likely to view particularly the Obama's mapped out plan with the drawdown, for example, in the middle of next year? And
well, there are a couple paradoxes involved here, right? One is that Republicans actually support the Afghanistan policy much more than Democrats. And in fact, the base Democratic vote across the country has been turned off by the escalation in Afghanistan. On the other hand, to appease the party, he has the July 2011 drawdown from Afghanistan, which Republicans strongly oppose and think gives the enemy a chance to plan and all of the usual kind of arguments. I mean, everyone's forgotten that we were there to find Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is not there, and they're sending packages from Yemen, but that's another story. I mean, they talk about mission creep, but it's unclear what the mission is.
It wasn't mission creep. It was more that our foreign policy idealism asserted itself over practical considerations. We decided that while we were in Afghanistan, we had to remake that society into something that we could feel comfortable with. And so we took on a whole number of issues, many of which work against our primary goal of removing Afghanistan as a base for Al-Qaeda and for terrorism.
I would say that it was, it's a good argument, but I would say it was purely you had to be doing something to look tough on terrorism. If we were going to say we're going to pull out of Iraq, we had to be tougher somewhere else. Afghanistan's where we took resources away to go into an optional Iraq war. So we just had to be there, and then we invented reasons. It's been extremely costly. It's now very unpopular. But here's the problem, right? I think from a standpoint of winning in 2012 and solidifying the base, he needs to draw down in 2011. But can, given public attitudes, the Republicans make hay with that? And what will that do with their coalition, given that the Tea Party, for example, is premised on not focusing on foreign policy issues? So it creates a lot of complexity. And of course, you don't know if there are going to be any interesting terrorist attacks or other things that roil public opinion and change the context between now and the next presidential election.
I wouldn't put too much importance on what the Tea Party people said during the campaign. Rarely do any of these politicians carry through with any great encompassing of their values that they expressed during the campaign into real political life.
What's interesting is this: you create something that you lose control of to some degree. There is an organic piece of the movement, and it is organized, and it has blogs, and it attacks things it doesn't like, and so inconsistencies with the orthodoxy actually may lead to a lot of political problems internally for them. So it's a little bit different than the usual political promises, and then you turn on a dime and nobody notices. Well, but it depends what it is and whether it would actually divide their constituency or not.
In some ways, it's kind of like what Obama did in terms of getting elected to the presidency. He turned on a piece of the society, of the electorate, and made them interested, and after 2 years, a lot of that went away.
Right, because the governing wasn't connected to the original message, which is a mistake a lot of leaders make in Republican form of government. That is, you actually have to maintain what you got elected on in the governing stage. You can't treat them as discrete. We'll see how well the Republicans do that, handle that transition.
Well, let's move to an issue where there really is a nexus between foreign policy and some of the economic issues that really underpinned this campaign. Issues of trade and trade agreements. How is the Congress likely to differ from the existing Congress?
Well, this is going to be very complicated because the Tea Partiers are less likely to be free traders, and what's left in the Democratic side are more hostile towards free trade. So I see this as an area, and this comes back to a conversation you and I had earlier, and why is all this going on? Well, I see this as part of the transition from the industrial to the information age, and there's a lot of things that are moving about, and there's winners and losers out there. And, we talk about conservatives being resistors. Well, on jobs and the manufacturing area, I see the left wing as being a resistor to change because that change is happening and is going to continue to happen.
I think that trade is the one foreign policy issue that could be a first-tier political issue because it's connected to jobs, it's connected to losing jobs, right? It's connected to what's happened, which is the gutting of family-supporting middle-class jobs in this country over the last 30 years. I think it's a false dichotomy to say it's whether you believe...
Could you take the...
let me say, whether you believe in globalization or not. I think it's a matter of what its terms are. In other words, you can say that growing global economy is inevitable. It doesn't mean there has to be a race to the bottom where we pit our workers against the lowest paid workers in other countries. You could structure it in a way where the transition was less damaging to people in this country and also aided the growth of other countries and their development. And we haven't done that. We had the power to do that for years, but here's the problem. It's been that both parties have been divided to some degree on this, and between differences between some of their leaders and actual voters. And so there's a public consensus against unfair trade policies and a concern concern that it has caused a huge amount of suffering in this country. But the Democrats can't capitalize on it because the Obama administration actually would like to ratify these treaties, just as the Clinton administration before them, though many in Congress, as you pointed out, are on the other side of that. The Republicans have a problem. Their leadership would like to ratify these. On the other hand, it's unpopular even with their own voters and with Tea Party voters. And so if you ever sorted it out in this country where one party was clear on trade and had a clear, consistent position, it could be the dominant issue in election. It could lead to another election just like we had in 2010. It doesn't seem like it's going to happen because there is so much vested interest power in doing the current system that is bought into each party. And so each party is kind of co-opted and tainted on the issue to the extent that it can't clarify itself as a public issue.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it at that. It'll be interesting to see in the months ahead how the second 2 years of the administration's foreign policy differs from the first. And I'm sure we'll be able to cover those fascinating changes on International Focus. To our viewers, we'll see you next time on International Focus.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,